Thanks very much, Dave, and thanks, Mike, for those comments. I just wanted to stir it up a little bit, as I'm known to do, and Mike spoke of, on the one hand, the climate change commitments in the Paris Agreement, and on the other hand, the world energy economy. And I'll tell you up front, disclose my bias, I don't see those as two hands. I see those as one linked system. And so my job is to tell some tales from the trenches as an energy regulatory litigator, and also as someone who's on the ground in the Paris agreements and the associated negotiations on an annual basis. And I think there are three main points looking backward where I completely agree with Mike and Monica. We've got some work to do. Informed reform is absolutely necessary. And looking forward, and if we don't address those three main areas, then we won't achieve some semblance of stability, predictability, and a climate for investment, cooperation, and peace among energy stakeholders. And let me say up front again that if there is ever a jurisdiction that can navigate the murky middle ground, I believe it's Canada. I strongly and firmly believe that we have the intellectual capacity and the power to navigate what are very tough conversations as long as we continue to have them. And this in particular is where we've fallen down in the past. So let me get to my three specific areas that we need to address regardless of what the vehicle is, regardless of what the instrument is, and really learn from our past mistakes. The first is procedural fairness. The entire system of successful and sustainable and durable decisions must be grounded on the basis of audi alteram partem, the right to be heard. And there are very well-defined measures that constitute procedural fairness in Canada, or due process in the States, where we haven't done so great over the last 10 years, quite specifically. It includes standing, ensuring that you've got the right to be heard by a decision maker, whether that's a policy decision maker or a regulator. You must have the ability in some way, shape, or form, and it's foreshadowing to my second point, some way, shape, or form, to be heard. The second is in relation to evidence. We've touched upon the need for objective, arm's length evidence. And this has changed so dramatically in the last 5 years. Our millennials are using energy very differently than we, as Gen Xers or boomers, use energy. And we have to have some arm's length independent entity to look at that. Secondly, on supply, the alternatives have changed quite radically. Energy storage, associated transborder opportunities, elements of non-pipe, non-wire solutions to be considered in the context of where we're going is important. Even if we go with traditional energy solutions, we must have put our mind to where the future is going. The third is representation, the ability to be represented by a voice that knows the rules and can participate in the process meaningfully, whether that means by presenting evidence or cross-examining or adducing some semblance of documentation that makes sense. The fourth is, and I'm going to slow down when I say this one, freedom from bias and independence. Not only must justice be done, but it must be seen to be done. And this calls for an almost obsessive level of freedom from bias and independence of the individual decision makers, which doesn't mean that regulators and policy makers don't speak to each other, but it does mean that in the midst of a case that is live and active, there is not political interference with the decision maker's independence, and similarly, a decision maker doesn't consult with a policymaker prior to making a decision in the heat of evidence where there have been parties present. You need that judicial tribunal level of independence to sustain independent decisions. There's always generally a right of appeal. But certainly in that first instance, you need that sort of independence and freedom from bias. And last but not least, certainly in my near and dear current present, the duty to give reasons. It's very hard for any stakeholder to adhere to a decision which is not in its interest if there are no reasons supporting that decision. And we're facing this in a current First Nations case that we're representing a group of 10 First Nations on, and it's very challenging. And I should say up front that we represent energy companies, First Nations, utilities, governments, and NGOs across the board. So certainly I know that murky middle, and I know what it feels like, and I do believe there are definite opportunities. My two last points quickly, innovation and disruptive technologies. The current regulatory framework is not conducive to deviating and adapting and moving forward to address quite positive, lower cost, customer beneficial, company beneficial, disruptive and innovative technologies like electric vehicles, like energy storage, like cooperative commercial structures in the oil and gas industry. It's not so conducive to the old cost of service modeling, and we have to be dynamic and get ready for some transition and change there. And last but certainly not least, I think as a country, as specific regulators, we have done, and I hold myself in that group, a fairly poor job at addressing one of the most pressing issues of our nation, and that is First Nations energy poverty. We have a crisis of First Nations energy poverty in this country. We just finished a proceeding where the evidence was 10 First Nations communities had electricity reliability that was 2,081% worse than the provincial average where they were located. 500% worse than their northern neighbors. This means that babies were being born in blackouts. This means that insulin supplies were being destroyed in First Nations communities and traditional ways of life, including the hunt. And a year's worth of food was completely destroyed. It's not okay. We can do better. We have the capacity, and we need to look cooperatively, and I emphasize cooperatively, at alternate structures to do better.